No documented case has ever confirmed schizophrenia in someone born completely blind. Coincidence, or a clue about how reality fractures. This episode explores disturbing neuroscience, perception, and why the brain's inability to see might shield it from one of the most devastating mental illnesses known. So there's this study out of Western Australia. Nearly 500,000 children tracked over time. And buried in that data is something that made me stop and reread it 3 times. 66 kids born with cortical blindness, which is blindness caused by the brain itself, not the eyes. 0 cases of schizophrenia. Not one.
And look, I get it. 66 isn't a massive sample. But schizophrenia hits roughly 1% of the general population. You'd expect at least 1 case in there statistically, maybe 2. Instead, nothing. A complete blank where there should be data points.
Now hold on, because it's not just blind people don't get schizophrenia. That's too clean, too neat for how biology actually works. Peripheral blindness, where the eyes are damaged but the visual cortex sitting in the back of your brain is still intact, still humming along, still expecting input, you do see a few cases pop up there. Rare, but they exist. And here's where it gets messy. Congenital deaf-blindness actually shows higher risk than the general population. More than you'd expect, not less. So we're not looking at sensory deprivation as some blanket protection against psychosis. That theory falls apart immediately. We're looking at something very specific about how the visual brain develops, or doesn't develop, in darkness from day one. Think about what schizophrenia actually does to a person. It doesn't just make you hear voices, though that's what most people fixate on. It makes you see things that bend wrong. Faces that shift at the edges, shadows that carry weight and intention. Movement in your peripheral vision that vanishes when you turn your head. The disorder grabs the visual processing system, this incredibly complex machinery that your brain trusts more than almost any other input, and feeds it garbage data, corrupted files. And your brain, which evolved to believe its eyes above everything else, can't distinguish the signal from the noise anymore. You're standing in a room you've stood in 1,000 times, and suddenly, the room is lying to you. The walls are wrong, the light is wrong, and you have no way to know it. But if you've never had vision, those pathways don't exist. The architecture was never built. There's no visual processing highway for the disorder to hijack because the highway was never constructed in the first place. Wait, let's look at that again. Because people who go blind later in life, after the visual cortex has already wired itself up during childhood, already learned to expect and interpret light and shape and motion, they can still develop schizophrenia. The protective effect isn't about current blindness. It's not about whether you can see right now. It's about developmental blindness. The brain has to grow up in complete darkness for this shield to form, which tells us something important about timing. There's a window. The brain decides early on what kind of brain it's going to be, what inputs it's going to prioritize, what architecture it's going to build. And once those visual circuits are laid down, you're vulnerable to whatever can exploit them. Even if the eyes stop working later, the brain still has the machinery. The machinery can still malfunction. What happens in congenital blindness instead is this massive neural reorganization. The brain redirects resources. Touch gets more processing power, significantly more. Sound becomes spatially rich in ways sighted people rarely experience. Memory systems built from movement and echo and texture take over the work that vision would have done. The whole system reorganizes around non-visual input, and the result is a fundamentally different brain structure. And somehow, we're still not entirely sure of the mechanism.
that reorganization doesn't leave the same vulnerabilities. The rewired brain doesn't fracture along the same fault lines. Whatever schizophrenia needs to take hold, whatever neurological substrate it requires to manifest its particular brand of reality distortion, that substrate is absent or altered beyond recognition. Here's the part that sits with me. We've spent centuries, across cultures, across continents, associating blindness with prophecy, with seers, with oracles. People who cannot see this world, but supposedly perceive things beyond ordinary sight. The blind prophet is one of the oldest archetypes we have. Folklore got the direction wrong, maybe. Nobody's glimpsing hidden realities. But those stories noticed something. A brain that never learned to see doesn't break in the way that seeing brains break. It doesn't produce the visions, the distortions, the fractures between real and unreal that define schizophrenia. The blind aren't seeing more. They're protected from seeing things that aren't there. It's not mystical. It's not prophecy. It's just the wiring is different. The failure modes are different. Schizophrenia isn't random noise. It isn't chaos. It's a specific pattern of dysfunction that exploits specific circuits built to process a visual world. And if those circuits were never constructed in the first place, there's nothing to exploit. The disease needs an entry point that simply doesn't exist. The brain evolved to see, and that evolution left a door open. Some of us walk through lives where that door never gets used, and some of us, the ones who never had eyes to build that door in the first place, don't have to worry about what might come through it.